Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is author Andrew Raymer. In 1990, Harry Hay blessed Andrew as a younger elder of the tribe. Mark Thompson interviewed him for his 1994 book, Gay Spirit, along with 15 other writers, healers, teachers, and visionaries. Andrew's own books include Two Flutes Playing, A Spiritual Journeybook for Gay Men, Queering the Text, Biblical, Medieval, and Modern Jewish Stories, and Revelations for A New Millennium. He was born in Elm-hurst, New York, across the street from an amusement park called Fairyland, and now he lives in Oakland, California, up the street from an amusement park called Fairyland. You can read more about him and his work at andrewraymer.com. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. I'm honored and delighted to be here.
So I wanted to speak to a couple things that are in your bio. One of them was you mention, or the way it's written is you specifically point out that you're from Elm-hurst and live in Oakland, and there seems to be an emphasis of the trees. And I recall reading in some of your previous writings that you've talked about gay men's connection to trees. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
For me, there are two interwoven levels that play out. One is archetypal. So I have often spoken about what I call the role of gay men as guardians of the trees. And I have this belief that in ancient times, that there were always in every little tribal clan and community, what we would call gay men who were responsible for the trees, who went to the elders and said, you cannot chop down any of the trees in that grove. You can use 3 there. You can use 2 there. You must plant more here. But that was an innate ability of men like us in ancient times. The other is a piece that is woven together and emerges from it, which is whenever I have traveled anywhere, what I have noticed is that when you go to any city, town, or village or country, that gay men seem to find themselves drawn to parks, to trees, to locating other gay men in those kinds of territories outside. And I find that both amusing and interesting, that I don't think any other people that I'm aware of do that. I've never known lesbians to find each other in the depths of Prospect Park in Brooklyn or in the middle of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco or anywhere else that I've ever been. But I find this again and again, and it fascinates me. So for me, that's one piece where behavior and archetype are woven together in who we are. And I don't think it's universal. There are plenty of gay men who don't walk through parks looking for other gay men, but plenty of us do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's also something about the idea of the sacred grove and being called back there and connecting with other men who love men and being surrounded and held in that way by the trees too.
I agree with you completely.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lead-in to a little piece that I actually wrote in 2002 that touches on some of these points that I would like to read. It's called Declaration on the Role of Gay Men in the World. We are an ancient people because we live between male and female, matter and spirit, the living and the dead. And because we come from every other people, we are honored in many cultures for our capacity to link, connect, and unify. We have been called gatekeepers and bridge builders. We are the walks between people, a natural healing and peacekeeping force in the world. As consciousness scouts, we explore the terrain of life to find what is new and needed. We are transformational artists and beauty makers. We are healers, especially gifted as midwives for the dying. We have always met in sacred groves, for we are the guardians of the trees. Some of us work alone, others in community. Sometimes we work through our actions, and sometimes we work silently in prayer and meditation. Now is the time for us to own who we are as individuals and as a tribe in a world that needs our gifts.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. One thing that you actually just read that sort of stuck out to me, I'm curious to know more about what you think about it, was the term consciousness scouts. And I know as a gay man, a queer man myself, especially as a a therapist and a counselor, I can really identify with that. But I'm curious what that term consciousness scouts means to you in this context, perhaps.
It's an expression that I've been using for 20 or 25 or 30 years that both emerged from the people who were my teachers directing my consciousness that way. And looking back at this place that I guess I've alluded to, which is what's the crossover in a Venn diagram between archetype and stereotype? Where do we live our lives in that terrain? So that if there's a really exciting, hot, new restaurant, piece of theater, club, kind of music, in the culture that I grew up in, and to this day, it is very often a venue, a location, a form, a medium that, if not created by gay men, is visited by gay men, is discovered by gay men. So on a certain level, when I talk about consciousness scouts, I think that's one of the pieces of who we are in that space between archetype and stereotype. How many clubs have become popular because gay men went there? How many restaurants? How many kinds of music? How many forms of dance? So I see this playing out in so many levels. When I look back, all the gay men I've known in my life, I see that again and again, this relationship of innovation to exploration.
Mm-hmm. So we really are scouting consciousness on all these different levels and helping to bring consciousness or awareness through our scouting in a way out in the world.
I think because my model is tribal,
mm-hmm.
rooted in the past, any nomadic people always had one or two scouts that ran ahead and looked for water, food, lodging, shelter, protection, safety, beauty, and then came back. And then the rest of the body of the tribe slowly followed them. And in my little kind of Wizard of Oz imaginary world of the past, those people were often men who love men, who were racing out ahead and coming back. And then often crossing paths with other scouts, consciousness scouts, territorial scouts from other tribes, and making love in the trees, and sharing information, and exchanging spices, gemstones, shells that traveled for hundreds of miles to be used for trade objects in the interior of islands and continents. So that's my picture in the movie that I watch of the past, of what we're rooted in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I want to rewind a little bit. And you say in your book, Two Flutes Playing, that the work of that book, the writing, is from still small voices inside of you. And I've heard many others talk about having writing inside of them that wants to come out, but there's something about this writing of yours in this book that seems different to me. And I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about your experience of writing such works as, listening to these small voices inside of you versus other kinds of works that you've written, maybe like a story or a short column.
A really interesting question. Thank you for it. I have struggled with what it means to be someone who hears voices since I was a very little boy. I suspect all little children hear voices and have imaginary playmates and live in between realities. And I think some of us are probably more innately biologically programmed to do that than others. And in the society we live in, that's certainly drummed out of you. So I don't know who said this, there's an expression that I've often heard in my life, that when you talk to God, that's called prayer. And when you hear God talking to you, that's called insanity.
Mm-hmm.
And so how to live in this space as someone who's heard voices is I spent a good part of my life trying to block them out. And I think it was the changes of culture in the 70s that really allowed me to walk into a bookstore and buy something by Carlos Castaneda, to buy books by people who were channeling, to read things by Jane Roberts, to read about Edgar Cayce, and then to go to a deeper level that I didn't go to at first, which is to say, oh, wait, this is actually part of the Western prophetic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And what we say is, if someone is named Isaiah and they died thousands of years ago, they're allowed to hear voices. But if you're walking down the street of San Francisco in 2018 and you're hearing voices, you're not allowed to do that without needing to immediately go to see a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And so I feel like one of the things I can contribute to the conversation is to say, yes, this is a part of my experience. And to follow up on what you said, I hear very specific voices in my brain. They are in different locations. They are in some ways not unlike now that I'm talking to you on a telephone. You're not here. I can't see you. The apparatus is external to my body, and we're connected through wires and satellites and I don't know what else. But sometimes I hear voices inside my head. And as a writer, as somebody who has been writing consciously since third grade, one of the big differences for me between channeled writing and my own writing is that I can literally start a novel in 1975 and finish it 4 years ago. But I can sit down and open myself up to a voice that is succinct, articulate. The text is completely organized. I start it, I finish it, it's done. There's no editing, it's complete. And I'm grateful to be able to do both kinds of writing, but they're very, very different for me. And I can't remember, and maybe you can help me with this. The name of who said this may come back to me, but it was someone in the 70s who said, mystics and madmen are standing at the edge of the same sea, but madmen don't know how to swim. It might have been Joseph Campbell.
I like that. And I just want to thank you for sharing that part of your own experience. And, you know, as someone who works with other people, I think it can be scary to share that experience, that we may hear voices. And, you know, as you were saying in this quote, one of the ways I interpret that difference between mystics and madmen is, you know, as you said, the way that culture holds it, and also the way that those people are supported, you know, coming from someone being in a tribal culture, as you were talking about, those people are supported to become mystics, whereas people who maybe grow up in an urban culture or just more modern culture where that's not supported is the ones who may end up, quote unquote, madmen and are just left to medication or to institutions to be taken care of and not listened to.
I think that's one of the tragedies of Western society, maybe global society and urban life, is that the kind of recognition that probably a child would have gotten in ancient times and in other places is lost. So in my imaginary past, which may or may not have been real, as a storyteller, I'm not sure that it matters, elders recognized very early on, this is a child who will hear voices. This is a child who will see visions. This is a child who is different. This is a child who is going to go on to do things that we will train this child to do. And we don't have that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think one of the essential pieces of queer culture is mentoring. That, I think, is probably the most essential spiritual practice that we who are older need to cultivate right now, which is to look at the younger people around us as elders, to be available to mentor, to be available to hold. Because I know in the crossover of my tribal identities, I'm sometimes a Jewish gay man and I'm sometimes a gay Jew. The order switches. Man always comes last. The first two reverse. I know what it was like to be told the stories of my people, to be nurtured, to be cultivated as a Jew of the future by my grandparents, great-grandparents, teachers, elders, rabbis. I didn't have that as a queer person. And in some ways, I think we still haven't crafted that kind of culture in the queer world. And I think there's still a level of fear and suspicion that often younger queer people have for older queer people. I went to an intergenerational LGBTQ gathering a few months ago, and with almost no exceptions, none of the younger men would talk to me at all, except in monosyllables. And some of the younger women would, and some of the non-binary people would if they recognized that I might be genderqueer or non-binary. And it made me really sad that was the case. And I thought, this is my imagination. But then I ran it by someone who I went with, and she said, no, I was aware of that at our table, who was talking to you and who wasn't. As it turned out, I was the oldest person in the room.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that shifts. I'm hoping that younger people begin to recognize this is our family. These are our elders. And in some ways, it's different because I think younger people, where we are in the Bay Area, aren't so likely to have been thrown out of their families when they came out. As certainly was the case when I was younger, or run away from home and never come out to their families, but keep a distance and lose that connection. So I'm hoping we'll build structures in different ways.
I do too. And I really appreciate that you are someone who's attempting to do that work on some level too.
Okay, and that's certainly part of what you're doing by doing this. You're making conversations available to people who might be living in Iowa or somewhere in the middle of Siberia or in a tiny little town in Australia who can get this information in what seems to me the 21st century equivalent of telepathy.
I like that. The podcast is the 21st century version of telepathy.
Yes.
Before we get too far from it, I just want to quickly give a resource for listeners based on what we were talking about of people hearing voices and being madmen versus mystics. There's actually a documentary that came out last year that was crowdfunded called Crazy Wise, and they interview a lot of different kinds of spiritual teachers and therapists and healers about this topic. And they also follow two modern day people who struggled with walking that boundary. So I just wanted to throw that out for some of our listeners to check out that movie, Crazy Wise.
That's great. I never heard of it, so I just wrote it down and I will check it out. I think in my journey, I was very blessed I think I was 20 years old, and I confided in one of my teachers what was happening to me. And she sent me off to an Orthodox rabbi who is a mystic, who I expected to tell me that I was crazy. But in fact, what he said was nothing about what I was doing, but about the container that I should be doing it in. And he said something very like, when you are grounded in your life and have a solid job and a solid community, then you can do this. And I don't know that advice saved my life. It's possible that it saved my sanity. And I have repeated that to younger people over the years when I crossed paths with them and they were at that place where they could have plunged into madness, psychosis, schizophrenia. And I think that that's really essential. And in the past, I think people who are biologically programmed to be capital L listeners would have been held by the whole tribe, nurtured.
Yeah.
And we don't have that.
Yeah.
So that's one more of the pieces to build. So I'm really glad that you mentioned Crazy Wise, and I can't wait to discover it myself. So thank you, Nick.
Yeah. So you just mentioned, and you've mentioned it a couple times before, these different ideas or experiences of community. And it's something you've written about in some of your writings, especially in your column in White Crane about your experience with the Gay Spirit Visions community. And I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I've noticed both myself as a gay man, even though I live in San Francisco, people assume that gay community should be readily available to you. But it's something that I notice both for myself and a lot of other queer people have really struggled with in terms of finding community. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, currently, and your experiences of community in the past, and how you've found and cultivated community.
Interesting question. Many years ago, I invented a model of who we are that I talked about. There's the first world nations, and then there's second world nations, and then there's third world nations. And someone else had invented this expression. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, which is actually fourth world nations. So fourth world nations are like Catalonia, like Wales, like other parts of the planet where countries have been absorbed into bigger countries, but they're actually separate and have a separate identity. But they're still territorial. They're still in some way biological. You're Welsh because your parents were Welsh. You're living in Hopi land, and that's what your biological ancestry is. So that's the fourth world. I didn't come up with that concept. Then I thought, well, maybe there's a fifth world and a sixth world. And I thought of people who are biologically connected who don't have territory, or their territory is very ancient. So I thought of myself as a Hebrew. I thought of people like the Roma and the Sinti, the Gypsies, who came from somewhere anciently but don't have a territory, even the way that fourth world countries do. So that's what I thought of as the fifth world. And then I thought of the sixth world, which are people, nations, tribes, clans, communities that aren't biological at all. So the gay tribe, the lesbian tribe, the differently abled tribe, blind, deaf, that all of these were a people that have characteristics. And if I travel to another part of the world and I sit down with someone who is Jewish, there's a rapport and a kinship, even if we barely speak the same language. If I wander into a room and I meet other people who are vision impaired as I am, we're not biologically related, but we navigate the world in a certain way. And the same for gay men, the same for all queer people. So I have this multiply fluid sense of communities, and I think that community is essential. It's another piece of what I was talking about mentoring. And so for me, going to the Gay Spirit Visions Conference for the first time, which meets in North Carolina and continues to meet, was radically transformative. It was the cauldron in which I was cooked. It was the womb in which I was carried as a writer, as a teacher. It was at Gay Spirit Visions that I first met Harry Hay in the very first year for the first time, and it was there that he gave me that blessing. And I mentioned it in my bio because if I was a younger elder then, I guess I'm an older elder now. And I'm really so grateful to have had Harry as a teacher there and then in other places. So much of my life was shaped by meeting, I think in the second year at Gay Spirit Visions, Malcolm Boyd. And Malcolm Boyd said something to me that I continue to live from, although I heard it but couldn't act from it at the time, which is he said something very like, to a room full of 100 gay men, it's our job right now to reclaim the Bible from fundamentalists so that they cannot continue to use it against us. And as a gay Episcopal priest, he stood in this world of, as a bridge builder between what was becoming kind of radical fairy communities and a mainstream established church. And I wasn't at that time ready to fully go back to my own Jewishness, but Malcolm opened the door and prepared the way in community for me to begin to go on that journey. So I'm profoundly grateful to him always, because I think that some of us are hermits. Some of us are deeply introverted. Some of us are solitary mystics. But even solitary mystics once a year need to have a convention. Do you remember the line in The Wizard of Oz about going off to hobnob with my fellow wizards? That was what Gay Spirit Visions felt like. And there are fairy gatherings all over. There are the Billies, there are other groups. And so even if it's for one weekend of the year for a gay or a queer person to be in community, because we almost never are the children of other queer people, that's so essential. It's very different for me as a Jew to hang out in Jewish spaces. I grew up in a Jewish family. I didn't grow up in a gay family. I have younger friends who did grow up in queer families. You know, I know people who have still T-shirts that say queer spawn, and that's their background. And some of them are queer, and some of them are not queer, but they're all queer spawn. And that changes the world. And we're social animals. So, I mean, even if you look at the history of hermits, often hermits were living in community in their own separate caves next to each other, in their own trees, and sitting on top of separate pillars in the same space. Thoreau writes about his time in Walden, but what people wrote about his time was that he wasn't always all by himself for those 2 years. People were bringing him food. He was going to town. So how we navigate our solitude, our isolation, our hermitage, our sense of being in family and community, everybody does differently, but I think it's really important. So I feel blessed that I had 20 years at Gay Spirit Visions Conference.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage everybody to look for whatever is their equivalent. And if you can't find it, start it. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was on the radio maybe 40 years ago. A group of Hopi elders came to speak at the United Nations. And one of them was interviewed on the radio. And what he said went right into my body. And this is now many years later, so I'm not sure that I got the words right. And I've hunted all over looking for it, but never been able to find it. But he said something rather like, white people, you're destroying the world. If you can't find community where you live, don't go looking for it somewhere else, make it. If you can't find beauty where you live, don't go somewhere else looking for it. Stay home and make it. And so for me, I have wandered at various times in my life, but I've also worked diligently following that amazing advice, especially in this time when one of the biggest carbon footprint risks that we take is to get on an airplane. I try to stay at home. I have a circle of friends who have taken vows that they will never get on planes again. So how do we not go to Costa Rica for the amazing yoga and meditation retreat? How do we find that in our backyard? Sometimes we have to make it.
Yeah, I've struggled with those questions myself as well. So thank you for naming that.
And have you come to more clarity? Or is that something that you continue to struggle with?
It's still a struggle, because I'm on the younger side of middle age now, and I still feel like there's a lot of experiences and places I want to go in the world. But I also think about, my carbon footprint, taking a plane, or how much plastic is generated in the world, and going to places where they don't have the ability to dump it somewhere and it ends up in oceans, and, seeing images and videos of, those plastic islands or clouds of plastic just floating in the ocean is really sad to me. So
I agree. It's heartbreaking. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
And it's easy sometimes to point a finger, big business, capitalism, consumerism.
Yeah, and I'm not
petroleum products. But we're buying. Exactly. But we're the ones that are buying it. How do we stop? That's the question. And I think that's one of the contributions that, at least in the bigger queer nation, if I'm onto anything at all, that gay men are the guardians of the trees, it's time for us to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
What was her name? Julia
Butterfly.
Mm-hmm. Yes, who went up in a tree. If I'm right, that archetypally, it's gay men who own all the forests on the planet, not to use, but to protect, then it's time for us to, maybe not go up in the trees, but to gather around them and say, sorry, can't chop down this last standing grove of old growth trees here. No, in fact, we have to change the world. I heard several years ago a very remarkable climate change journalist, Mark Hertzgaard, who wrote an extraordinary book called Hot. So the subtitle is something like How to Survive the Next 50 Years on Earth. And he said that we could solve all of the problems of the toxic things we've put in the air, but that we would need to plant 14 billion trees.
Mm-hmm.
And we would need to do that in the next 3 years. And he said this 4 or 5 years ago. He said, and then it will take 30 years for the 14 billion trees to suck up all the CO2 and the other things in the air, but they will do it.
Yeah.
So I think if we are the guardians of the trees and we're wondering what to do with whatever extra funds we might have in our lives, plant trees.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be wonderful? Is a way of changing the consciousness of queer people if everyone on the planet knew that we were at the vanguard. that those people who so have come to dislike us can also recognize, hey, they just came and planted 100,000 trees in our backyard. Thank you.
Well, I like how we started with trees and we've circled back to trees, which leads me up to my last question. And I think you had trees in part of your answer, which is, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
It's hard to come up with one, which was my long silent pause, but definitely trees. I spent my first 5 years in an apartment house in Elm-hurst, New York, with a kind of concrete backyard and no trees. There was a little park near us, but moving to the suburbs to a house with trees, I lived near, in, and by them. Trees and large bushes. As a shy kid, I hid out in the grove of rhododendrons in the back of the yard. That was my sacred space, long before I knew there was such a thing as a sacred space. As a 5 and 6 and 7-year-old, you could find me in the rhododendron grove or huddled behind the birch trees. And so I encourage everybody, not just to plant trees, but find the tree that is your best friend. Sit beside it. Just press your living, breathing, moving, undulating human spine up against the trunk of a tree as often as possible. Sit facing it, wrap your legs around it if it's not too big, and just feel what it's like to slow your body down so that your cells come into some deep rapport with the cells and the soul of the tree, and to remember that who we are as guardians of the trees comes from this kind of silent conversation.
As a child, I was just thinking about it now, I had a close relationship with a walnut tree in my backyard that I used to have a swing on and a tree house in. I used to just spend hours in the tree just listening to the wind and really felt safe there and supported.
I have my eyes closed and I don't know you well, but every once in a while, watching you across the room, you have a smile. And I remember thinking this once, I know what you looked like when you were a little boy from that smile. And so I'm sort of turning the film reel, although film reels I don't think exist anymore. But I'm sending time backwards and I'm picturing you in that tree. And I think that's probably the story of lots of us. So thank you for sharing it.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I know that you also said that you have a new book that you wanted to let us know about. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
Oh, thank you so much. I have been truly blessed in that most of my spiritual teachers as a gay man have been lesbians. And in part, my gift back was that I took the character of a woman who is mentioned only by name 3 times in the Bible, but has become a very minor character in Jewish folklore, and I became her. My inspiration in some ways was Flaubert, who said, I am Madame Bovary. So I became someone named Serach Bat Asher, and I wrote a book that is called Deathless. And there is no indication anywhere in traditional Jewish folklore that she was a lesbian, but in my retelling of her story, she is a 3,324-year-old lesbian who is now living in Venice Beach, California, and telling the story of everything that she has witnessed and what really happened in the stories that are preserved in edited and garbled versions in our Bible today. So there are queer families, there are women of power, there are women of vision, there are gay men wandering in and out of my texts. So it's called Deathless. It comes from a very wonderful publishing company called Width and Stock. And there is something really deliciously delightful for me about becoming this woman. It's not a channel book. I worked on it for a very long time. So it's some other category because I felt like I became this woman, Sarah. So thank you for asking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds really great. I had this interesting vision of her sitting on her porch in Venice Beach, collecting stories and telling stories and sharing wisdom. So I look forward to checking that out.
Well, great. Thank you so much.
So before we say goodbye, is there anything you want to share with our listeners about how they can find you, your writings, and your readings, I guess, or your work?
Thank you. I do have a website, and it's andrewraymer.com. There's a little section that has all of my books and has in it particular pieces of writing that I gathered together, asking myself a question that's so informed by something we didn't talk about, which is having lived through the height of the AIDS epidemic. I expect to die every single day. And at some point I thought, what do I feel is essential if the big quake comes just in 2 minutes from now or 4 seconds and I'm squished? What do I want preserved? And so some of those pieces are also up, I think, in stories and in teachings up on the website. So thank you for that question.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful chatting with you. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to connecting with you more soon.
Likewise. Thank you. And thank you for doing this. It's a great gift to all of us. So blessings on this endeavor. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks for listening to the Queer Spirit Podcast. To find out more about all the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. You can also continue the conversation by joining the Queer Spirit Community Facebook group. Simply search Queer Spirit Community on Facebook. See you next time.